This is a video discussing various questions and theories surrounding Kvothe in the Doors of Stone, from his parentage to why he's in an inn to if he'll ever meet Abinthy again. This is the first in a series of videos discussing different theories and questions about the Doors of Stone. Since this is the first of several videos to come, it's appropriate to start with the protagonist. So, let's begin. One of the most important questions related to Kvothe is that of his parentage. On first read, it may seem simple. He is the son of Arliden and Laurian, who are of the Edema, who travel and perform across the lands. But it's not quite that simple. There is compelling evidence that Kvothe is actually a lackless, who are one of the oldest families in the history of Temerant, and likely descend from 𝐊𝐯𝐿 himself. Our first hints that this theory may be true are actually given to us quite early in the Name of the Wind. As 𝐊𝐶 begins his story, he says that his mother was a noble before she was a trooper, and that it was Arliden who lured her away from a miserable, dreary hell. Our second piece of evidence that Kvothe is a lackless is a poem that Arliden recites. Laurian, Arliden's wife, has a face like the blade of a knife, has a voice like a prickle-down burr, but can tally a sum like a moneylender. My sweet Tally cannot cook, but she keeps a tidy ledger book. For all her faults, I do confess, it's worth my life to make my wife not tally a lot less. Not tally a lot less. Phonetically, it sure sounds like Natalia Lackless. And we do know that Rothfuss loves to hide bits of truth in songs, poems, and stories in the world of Temerant. On the subject of poems, we hear another one in the early parts of Name of the Wind. 7 things has Lady Lackless, keeps them underneath her black dress. 1 a ring that's not for wearing, 1 a sharp word not for swearing. Right beside her husband's candle, there's a door without a handle. In a box, no lids or rocks. Lackless keeps her husband's rocks. There's a secret she's been keeping. She's been dreaming and not sleeping. On a road that's not for traveling, Lackless likes her riddle raveling. This poem is very interesting. First, we get our earliest reference to the lackless box, and second, raveling in this context is almost certainly referring to the ravel, which is a derogatory term for the Edema. The story seems to be saying that Lady Lackless is cheating on her husband, possibly with a member of the Edema. It would make sense that if Laurian is Natalia, she would be pretty upset to hear such a rhyme. And wouldn't you know it, when she first hears it, she tells Kvothe off, saying that Lady Lackless is a real person with feelings that can be hurt. In the wise man's fear, Kvothe heads to Vintas. He assists Mayor Alvaron there, with courting a woman named Meluan Lackless. When he meets her for the first time, Kvothe thinks she's oddly familiar, but he can't place why. I walked the Lady Lackless to the table and held at her chair. I had avoided looking in her direction as we walked the length of the room, but as I helped her into her seat, her profile struck me with such a strong resemblance that I couldn't help but stare. I knew her. I was certain of it, but I couldn't for the life of me remember where we might have met. As I took my seat, I tried to guess where I might have seen her before. If the Lackless lands weren't 1,000 miles away, I would have thought I knew her from the university, but that was ridiculous. The Lackless heir wouldn't study so far from home. Lastly, we learned during Kvothe's time in Vintas that Meluan Lackless had a sister who ran away from home with a band of traveling troopers. And ever since that moment, she's hated the Edema. If this theory is true, and it almost certainly is, then Kvothe is a member of an ancient and powerful family. The Lackless family is tied to deep secrets, like whatever is inside the Lackless box, probably 𝐊𝐶 eye, and the Lackless door, which could contain 𝐊𝐯𝐿 behind it. We learn from another poem in the books about the lackless door and 7 things that stand before it, one of which is a son who brings the blood. I'll discuss the lackless poem in more detail in its own section, but for now, it's worth noting that if Kvothe is to unleash 𝐊𝐯𝐿 upon the world for a second time, or whatever is behind the door, he would be the son who brings the blood. Perhaps that's also how he opens the lackless box. To do all of that, he'll have to return to Vintas. And while there, he'll have a chance to speak to Meluan once more. Perhaps he'll get an audience by asking 𝐊𝐶 for a favor, considering he's in debt to Kvothe for saving the mayor's life. This would be the perfect time for Kvothe to learn who he really is, or at least confirm suspicions he may begin to have. By the end of Wise Man's Fear, he seems oblivious to who he actually is, but that's likely to change in early chapters of Doors. By whatever means he learns, though, this will, no doubt, lead to tragedy. Compared to the previous theory, this one is somewhat insignificant, but it is a question that should be answered. Who calls Kvothe Dulator, and what does it mean? If you recall, Kvothe says that his first real lover called him Dulator because she liked the sound of it. 2 books in, none of the characters Kvothe has had any romantic involvement with have ever referred to him as such. So the first question would be, who does Kvothe feel is his first lover? In the most technical sense, this would be Felurian, but she never calls him Dulator. Now it's possible he could return to her, and it's during that second series of escapades that she refers to him as such. But we have no proof that Kvothe ever returns to see Felurian. Also, it seems unlikely that Kvothe would see Felurian as his first real lover. But who does that really leave? The obvious answer is Denna, but 2 books in, she has yet to refer to him as such, and the word lover wouldn't quite apply to Denna, since they've kept it nice and wholesome. Now, of course, there'll be plenty of time for that to change in the Doors of Stone. Of all the options here, it seems the most likely. It makes sense. Kvothe loves Denna. Denna probably loves Kvothe. So of all the options, this one is the likeliest. But let us theorize for a little bit. What if it's someone else? What if it's Devi? Devi and Kvothe have an odd relationship, considering she's a loan shark, and up until the end of Wise Man's Fear, Kvothe is an impoverished student forced to go into debt under her. But at the end of the book, he's flowing with cash, and no longer requires her services. Now that he's financially free, perhaps a relationship could develop. This might be a bit of tinfoil, but in the name of the wind, Kvothe says to Chronicler, "I will try. She is in the wings now, waiting for her cue. Let us set the stage for her arrival." Now, most people would say this applies to Denna, which it probably does, but it is worth noting that the first woman that Kvothe encounters after saying that is Devi. Does that mean something? Maybe. Others have mentioned that it could be Ari. In the slow regard of silent things, she creates a new name for Kvothe, which she hopes to give to him when it's needed. Maybe that name is Dulator. It's hinted that Kvothe may spend some time in the Underthing, which does sound like an opportunity for a relationship to develop. Of course, that's all ignoring that Kvothe doesn't have a flicker of romantic interest in her, for obvious reasons. She's not in her right mind. Though there is time for that to change. It could be that Kvothe helps heal her shattered mind, and she returns to a more reasonable state. And with some fans believing that Ari is Princess Ariel, it sounds like a tragic story waiting to happen, where Kvothe saves the princess and then they fall in love. Only in this version, Ari dies. We are told that Kvothe seems like the kind of man that could kill an angel. And of all characters who have angelic features or angelic personalities, Ari's a pretty good fit. Also, it doesn't really make sense for Kvothe to discuss Ari and where she lives, unless she's dead or is somewhere else completely. Though I also should say, Kvothe does discuss plenty of other secrets, so it could be that he doesn't think this story will ever see the light of day, or he just doesn't care anymore. Or it's because the story would really suck if Kvothe didn't tell any secrets. I know this one isn't a big theory, but it bugs me that it's never been answered. Though my personal theory is that Dulator is a nickname for Patrick Rothfuss, because for him, Doors of Stone is something he'll do later. Who did Kvothe kill in Imre? In the frame story, a drunken guest at Kvothe's inn recognizes him and says, "I saw the place in Imre where you killed him, by the fountain. The cobblestones are all shattered." He frowned and concentrated on the word. Shattered. They say no one can mend them. So who is this person that Kvothe kills, and how did he do it in such a way that they can't repair the cobblestones? One theory is that this is the story of when Ambrose broke Kvothe's lute, and in response Kvothe calls the name of the wind and injures him. We've seen examples of stories being distorted over distance and time in this world, and that could very well apply here. The only issue is the cobblestones. Stones are not damaged during the loot scene, and even if they were, calling the wind shouldn't be enough to shatter them beyond repair. We also have a direct witness who claims he himself saw the stones, so something else must have happened here. Who did Kvothe kill, and by what means did he do it? Now, Kvothe actually killing Ambrose is the obvious choice, almost to the point of being a red herring. Since these two characters have first interacted, their feud has only grown. It comes to a point that Ambrose sends men to kill Kvothe, or at least that's what Kvothe believes. It is possible that someone else sent those men, but regardless, it's still escalation. Add to that the loot encounter we just mentioned, the Jackass song, the Plumbob incident, the malfeasance attacks, Kvothe setting fire to Ambrose's room, Kvothe's ship being attacked by pirates in an area that Ambrose's father controls. Yeah, it really seems like this feud is heading for a final, possibly lethal encounter. So let's assume that's how it's all going to play out. How will Kvothe do it then? The easiest answer would be that he learns the name of Stone. So far in the first 2 books, Kvothe hasn't learned the name of Stone, but he does understand the name when Elladan speaks it, and we also hear of a rhyme in the frame story that insinuates that Kvothe wears a stone ring to signal his naming mastery over it. I'll be discussing that ring later, but for now, it does appear Kvothe will learn the name of Stone at some point. True, we don't know when in the timeline, but he could learn it before he's expelled from the university for good. This is all assuming that it's Kvothe who shatters the stones, though. It doesn't have to be. There is another character we know for certain has a mastery over stone. That would be Fela. Some fans have theorized that Simon will die in the 3rd book. This is mostly based on how Kvothe speaks of Simon in the frame story. On one occasion, he gives a toast saying, "To friends who deserved better than they got." This would all fit in with the tragic theme of the series. That Kvothe accidentally or is tricked into killing Sim, and Fela shatters the cobblestones in her grief. If it isn't Ambrose or Simon, it could be Cinder. Of all the Chandrian, Cinder receives the most screen time, and he is shown to be the cruelest of the bunch. In the frame story, there's a strange sword at the end, and many suspect it's Cinder's, as the description of the two are very alike. So it could be at this fountain that Kvothe and Cinder fight, and Kvothe wins. But if that's true, how does Kvothe kill one of the 7, who've been alive for thousands of years? Just using the name of Stone doesn't seem like it'd be able to kill one of the Chandrian. It could be that there's knowledge behind the 4-plate door, and Kvothe will open the door and somehow use this knowledge to eliminate Cinder for good. Could also be that he returns to the Fae and while there, gains some ability or item. It could even be that Kvothe is able to speak Cinder's true name, which seems to be Firichuuu, and is able to use that to destroy him. We know the Chandrian, or at the very least Cinder, can be controlled with his name, as we see when Haliax does it. Now, does that mean he could kill him with it? We don't know. We do know, though, that the Chandrian have enemies, the Sith, the Emir, and the Singers. They must fear these groups, or, at the very least, are apprehensive about fighting them, considering how quickly they flee during their first appearance. So there must be some way to harm them. If it's none of the above, others have also put forward 𝐻𝐻𝐻 and Breton, the mayor, or even Roderick Calanthus. None of these seem very likely. Breton, the mayor, and Calanthus would have to travel pretty far. And by the end of Wise Man's Fear, none of those 3 have a reason to come to Emir. And the evidence for 𝐻𝐻𝐻 is based on tinfoil that he's somehow secretly working against Kvothe. It's possible, to be sure, just pretty far-fetched. Abinthy is one of the most important characters in these books. His screen time may be limited, but he is the one that sets Kvothe down the path of the arcane. He shows Kvothe that naming is real and not just storybook magic. He teaches him about sympathy and the heart of stone. And yet, despite his importance to this story, he leaves just as quickly as he arrives. And since his last appearance in early chapters of Name of the Wind, we have never gotten another on-screen appearance. Some fans see Abinthy as fulfilling his role in the story, and thus no longer needing to be an active character, meaning Kvothe will never see him again. But if that's the case, why have this line? Young as I was, I knew the truth. It'd be a great long time before I saw him again. Years. And taking that even further, if Abinthy is never to appear again, why have him leave the troupe? Why write that whole party scene? Indeed, why have him survive at all? It would have been far easier to sentence him to the same fate as the rest of Kvothe's traveling band. But that's not what happens. He gets a nice bow-out scene, getting a stable job as a brewer and a lovely widow to go along with it. Really, Hallowfell seems like a wonderful place to live out the rest of your years. But why give him this job? Why give him this stable place to stay? Unless it's so Kvothe can meet him once more. Abinthy is the only person left from his pre-Chandrian life. Can you imagine the conversation between them? How powerful it could be? Kvothe has only told 2 people, as far as we know, the truth about his past. That being the Chronicler and Bast. And no doubt Bast understands what the Chandrian are, but he didn't know Kvothe's troop. Abinthy did. And not only that, but in a world that dismisses the Chandrian as fairy tales meant to scare children, Abinthy is afraid of them, or at the very least, wary of speaking their true names. Speaking of names, that's another point I'm having trouble with, my father said. There are a couple dozen I've collected that I'd appreciate your opinion on. The most... Actually, Arl, Ben interrupted. I'd appreciate it if you didn't say them out loud. Names of people, that is. You can scratch them in the dirt if you'd like, or I can fetch a slate, but I'd be more comfortable if you didn't actually say any of them. Now I'm not saying that the Chandrian are out there, striking like lightning from the clear blue sky, but folk everywhere are afraid of them. There's usually a reason for that. And names are strange things, dangerous things. He gave them a pointed look. That I know for true because I am an educated man. If I'm a mite superstitious too, he shrugged. Well, that's my choice. I'm old. You have to humor me. There is more to Abinthy than just a wandering arcanist. Whether that be that he's secretly a Chandrian or a member of the Emir or something else is unknown. But he does know more than most, and Kvothe really does need to talk to him one last time. When Aaron, the blacksmith's apprentice in Newair, tells Kvothe that he's headed off to enlist in the penitent king's army, Kvothe attempts to dissuade him by revealing that he's Kvothe. Aaron doesn't believe him, but during that conversation, we hear a rather interesting rhyme about Kvothe the Arcane. Aaron nodded doggedly. Yes, sir, and your scribe there is right. He had his cloak made all out of cobwebs and shadows, and he wore rings on all of his fingers. How does it go? On his first hand, he wore rings of stone, iron, amber, wood, and bone. The smith's apprentice frowned. I can't remember the rest. There was something about fire. The innkeeper's expression was unreadable. He looked down at where his hands lay, spread on the top of the bar, and after a moment he recited. There were rings unseen on his second hand. One was blood in a flowing band, one of air all whisper thin, and the ring of ice had a flaw within. Full faintly shone the ring of flame, and the final ring was without name. That's it, Aaron said, smiling. You don't have any of those behind the bar, do you? He stood on his toes as if trying to get a better look. Kvothe gave a shaky, shamefaced smile. No, I can't say as I do. We know that stories in this world can and often are exaggerated. Time and distance will always distort the truth of a tale. But we also know that in this world, stories and songs can often hide tidbits of truth. Secrets can hide in rhyme. So there might be something to these 10 rings. We know that in Temerant, rings can carry meaning. In Vintas, it's a form of social rank. You send rings with different types of metals or other materials in relation to your own to other people. Gold for someone above you, silver for equal or unknown, and iron for below. This is mostly a court game, though the practice emerged with commoners and some continue to do it. Also, rings in Vintas aren't always about social rank. When 𝐊𝐯 gives Kvothe a ring of bone, it has nothing to do with court intrigue. Instead, it's professing a profound debt for saving the life of his friend, the mayor. Rings can also be used to signify something else. That is to say, naming. If one has proven themselves to master a specific name, they can receive a ring made of the material. Fela gets one from Elodin after mastering the name of stone. Kvothe's first hand has iron, amber, wood, and bone. Now, bone could be signifying a mastery of that name, but it could also be that this is the ring that 𝐊𝐯 gives him. The wooden ring follows the same sort of logic. Could be that Kvothe has mastered the name of wood, but this could also be the ring Meluan gives him, which is supposed to be an insult for being a Demaroo, and he's wearing it out of a form of stubborn pride, likely with the same sort of logic as Tyrion in a Game of Thrones.
Never forget what you are. The rest of the world will not. Wear it like armor. It can never be used to hurt you.
This still leaves us with iron, stone, and amber. As discussed earlier, it could be that Kvothe kills someone at the fountain in Imre with the name of stone. If that's true, it would make sense that he would have mastered stone enough to receive a ring. We do know that he can hear the name of stone, as we learn when Elodin turns the walls of his former cell to sand. Oh, Elodin said, suddenly laughing, that was half clever of them. He took 2 steps back from the wall. I'm not even going to try to pronounce the name of stone, I'll just leave it on screen. There it is. Kvothe can understand that. If your mind doesn't know or is unable to comprehend a name, you just hear the basic word, as we learn in chapter 84 of Name of the Wind. He looked at me. His dark eyes steadied me somewhat, slowed the storm inside me. Erlev Seti, he said. Say it. What? Simon said, somewhere in the distant background. Wind? So Kvothe is probably able to, or was at some point, able to call the name of stone. Iron might be the same. We have no direct evidence that he can understand iron like he does stone, but considering his cleverness, he could probably learn the name of iron in time. It could also be a vintage ring, but it's unclear who to consider Kvothe to be an equal. That covers 4 out of 5 rings on his first hand, leaving us now with amber. It could be that he simply learned its name and now displays the ring as a symbol of his mastery over it. However, There are some hints throughout the books that amber has special properties. In Wise Man's Fear, Will makes reference to amber rings during a conversation where he says, "And a ring of red amber that gives me power over demons." And later in Wise Man's Fear, we also read this: "There at the bar, I learned many things. Apparently, I owned a ring of amber, which could force demons to obey me." When Kvothe hears the latter quote, he's not actually in possession of an amber ring, but that could change. In the Slow Regard of Silent Things, Ari does mention an amber ring on 2 separate occasions. She stood in the center of the room and spun in a circle to see it all, and when her eyes passed over the ring on the table, she saw it no longer belonged here. It was free to go as it pleased. It sang golden all through itself, and the amber it held was as gentle as an autumn afternoon. And later, there was her newfound ring of autumn gold. That was fine enough surely, and it suited him, twice bright, but as gift it was foreboding. She did not wish to hint at him of demons. It sure sounds like Kvothe will, at some point, be receiving an amber ring as a gift from Ari. Even in the newest release, The Narrow Road Between Desires, we hear of amber rings. Despite what stories said, it was no simple thing to truly bind one such as Bast. And the list of things that could do so as sudden, hard, and heavy as this gift had managed was short indeed. Grandfather Iron would work, of course, or a piece of star that fell to earth. One of a handful of dark and ancient links of broken chain, but those were dark, and what he'd glimpsed was bright. A seal of sovereign gold might work, but only with the proper names. A ring of amber was an older trick, but Bast hadn't seen one in a mortal age. Besides, he would have to put it on his finger. Now, Bast not seeing an amber ring does imply that Kvothe never had or has long since lost his, or maybe it's in the thrice-locked chest. Anyway, this evidence does show us that amber rings have some sort of binding power. Perhaps Kvothe will use it sometime in Doors of Stone. Or maybe it's used against him. Some people do believe that Kvothe actually has a drop of Fey blood, which is due to the possibility that the Lackless family is descended from 𝐊𝐯. Or it could be from the time that Florian stopped his heart and then restarted it. Maybe that would be enough to control him. It would be quite tragic if Kvothe was binded to a member of the Chandrian or the Emir and forced to do their bidding. But maybe that's getting a little too tinfoily. Kvothe's other hand has the unseen rings of ice, which has a flaw within, blood, air, flame, and one without a name. Let's start with ice. We can assume that everything in Temerant has a true name. Objects, individuals, elements, even celestial bodies, if the stories about 𝐊𝐯 are to be believed. This means that Kvothe learning the name of water isn't crazy, but then this brings up questions of why it's specifically ice, and what does the rhyme mean by saying it has a flaw within? If Kvothe knew the name of water, wouldn't he just wear a band of flowing water? Maybe it's because he never fully mastered the name of water, and therefore his unseen ice ring is flawed in some way? This is the simplest explanation for all of them, of course, that he learned the names of air, flame, and blood, which we can stretch to make work, except for the last one, which doesn't have a name. Some have theorized this could be copper, as it's hinted that copper may not have a name. And getting into tinfoil territory, it could also be silence. A large part of Kvothe in the Frame story is related to his silence. I mean, it's the 10th word in the book, and the entire prologue is about it. So maybe he's learned to control the name of silence. During the Frame story, Kote, Bast, the Chronicler, and the rest of the Inn regulars are suddenly interrupted by the deserter who robbed the Chronicler days earlier. But this time, something is terribly wrong. He's speaking in an odd language, and when people inside the inn attempt to defend themselves, he takes far more damage than a normal person ever could. And it doesn't take long for Bast to realize it's a skin dancer, a species from the Fae long thought to be extinct. Now thankfully, they managed to defeat it, but we still don't know why the skin dancer was looking for Kvothe, but we still don't know what the skin dancer was looking for, and what was it saying in that mysterious language. Let's examine what the skin dancer said first, as that may help us understand what exactly it was looking for. Now in this scene, we get 5 different examples of the language, as seen here. And due to some very clever and diligent fans, we can get a rough idea of what's being said. The shortest and easiest one here is Teyrente. Of all the phrases spoken, this one has the most consensus about possible meanings. One meaning is based on a phrase we hear much earlier in the story.
For Phelan Renata More.
This is the phrase that lies above the doors of the archives, and as we learned from Willem, means something to the effect of the desire for knowledge shapes a man. The word rinta seems to mean shape, and te is likely you or your. This means the skin dancer could be asking if he's a shaper. The other meaning comes to us from the Edema. While among the Bloodshirt mercenaries, Kvothe inquires about the Chandrian, and we learn that in Edema, they refer to them as the rinta. So it could be that the skin dancer is asking if he's a Chandrian. Now, both of these phrases are too close to not be connected. It's likely that the Chandrian are shapers themselves, but since none of us speak a mysterious Feyan language, it's hard to distinguish if the question is about shaping, the Chandrian, or both. The next phrases are pretty difficult to parse. We don't have enough examples of the language to form perfect translations. But some fans have tried, and what we have seems to confirm that yes, the skin dancer is looking for a shaper or a shaped person or something to do with the Chandrian. Unfortunately, we don't have any more information than that. There's just not enough here. Really, it all boils down to this. Someone or something is looking for Kvothe. It could be because of his knowledge of the Chandrian, or of the Emir. It could be because he killed Cinder, and perhaps the rest of the Chandrian are looking for revenge. Or perhaps it's the Sith, come to collect their due for Kvothe meeting the Kvothe. Unfortunately, as with so many other parts of this story, we just don't know. For a series titled Kingkiller, there is a noticeable lack of regicide. We know that Kvothe will kill a king, and we know that the consequences of that are a bloody civil war. But which king is it? Where is this civil war? Who's fighting it? And who is the penitent king? First, the king that Kvothe kills. Some have theorized that this king is Ambrose. He is nobility, and we do learn he's in line for the Vintish throne. But he's not that close. It would take the deaths of several more people in line for Ambrose to ascend to the throne. Now, in a more traditional story, it would make total sense that Ambrose and Kvothe's feud continues to build until Kvothe finally defeats the big bad guy, the evil king. But that could very well be a misinterpretation of Ambrose's role in the story. No doubt, Ambrose is an antagonist, but he's the Draco Malfoy of the series, a supporting villain, someone who causes conflict in the story, but with much lower stakes. In the end, Draco is tied to the main villain. But with Ambrose, that may not be the case. There are some fans that think Ambrose is a red herring. If that's the case, who else could it be? Well, there is the High King of Modeg, and there's also the Poet King that Vachette mentions several times. But we never actually learn the identity of either of these two characters, and I think it's unlikely that either one of them will be killed by Kvothe. Others believe it could be Simon. He is technically nobility, but in the text his father is referred to as a paper duke, not someone who could easily rise to power. So unless it's an unknown king who we haven't heard of, the options we have are the obvious and the unlikely. But of course, there is one other king it could be. In Wise Man's Fear, we hear about Roderick Calanthus, King of Vintas. Now, it may not seem obvious at first, but the text provides a lot of evidence that Kvothe will kill Calanthus. When Kvothe is retelling his story and reaches his meeting with the Kvothe, Bast is horrified. He compares the influence the Kvothe leaves on those who dare speak to it like a plague ship being steered into a harbor. The Kvothe can see all possible futures, and it guides its victims into the worst outcome it can find. So when it tells Kvothe that if he wants to learn more about the Chandrian who have to head to Edema, it's a guided attempt at causing harm. Kvothe heads to Edema, and there he does indeed learn about the Chandrian, and their true names. But that's not the only thing Kvothe learns. It's here in Edema that Kvothe is taught swordsmanship. The Kvothe has guided him into learning how to kill. Early in The Name of the Wind, Abinthy tells Kvothe, in some of the most direct foreshadowing in these books, that a clever and thoughtless man is one of the most terrifying things there is. Kvothe is clever, no one can deny that, but he's also thoughtless, and the Kvothe guiding him to Edema was like sending that plague-infested ship into a harbor. Because of course, Kvothe is clever enough to pick up on the Lethani and sword skills. He may not be the best fighter to ever live, and by Edema standards, he's not great, but he's still a force to be reckoned with. And at the end of the Edem section of the book, Kvothe finally receives a sword. Its name is Caesura, but Kvothe privately renames it to Caesura. Kvothe has a knack for names. He calls Denna's patron Master Ash, which seems to be a hint towards it being Cinder. He gives the name Ari to Ari, something that impresses Eladin, the master of naming, so much that he invites him to his class. He, if only for a brief moment, gains the name of Felurian. So the word 𝐊𝐶ura is interesting in that regard, for it very well seems that his knack for naming has kicked in here. In fact, when Vashett first hands him the sword, he confuses the two names, 𝐊𝐶ura and 𝐊𝐶ura. Vashett took the scabbard from the wall and sheathed the sword. Then she turned and held it out to me. This is named 𝐊𝐶ura. 𝐊𝐶ura? I asked, startled by the name. Sensing something was expected of me, I drew it from its sheath. The faint ring of leather and metal seemed a whisper of its name. 𝐊𝐶ura. It felt light in my hand. The blade was flawless. I slid it back into its sheath, and the sound was different. It sounded like the breaking of a line. It said, 𝐊𝐶ura. We learn the meaning of this word from the only poet Kvothe likes. What is that pause you keep doing? He asked. It's like you can't catch your breath. I ask that too, Fella said, smiling. It's something they use in Eldvintic verse, Sim explained. It's a break in the line, called a 𝐊𝐶ura. Kvothe will strike down Roderick Colanthus, and this will cause a break in the line of succession. The sword is later called 𝐊𝐶ura the Poet Killer because of the changes and stories that occur as they travel around the world. Somewhere in that long game of telephone that word-of-mouth stories operate by, 𝐊𝐶ura, or the break in the line of poetry, will become 𝐊𝐶ura the Poet Killer. Kvothe even thinks it's a poet's sword when he first receives it. If you aren't convinced, let us turn to a different piece of evidence. A conversation between Kvothe, the mayor, and Stapes about the name of the small bright yellow and red birds that prove the mayor is being poisoned by his arcanist. Sipquicks? Tiny bright things, yellow and red. I held up my fingers about 2 inches apart. They're thick in your gardens. They drink the nectar from your celis flowers. Oh, we call them flits. But it's a little rough on the poor Colanthus. Beg pardon? I asked. Our Stapes is old-fashioned, Alvaron explained with a smile, and more educated than he cares to admit. Colanthus is the Eldvintic word for them. I could swear I've heard that word somewhere else. It's also the name of the royal line of Vintas, Alvaron said, chidingly. It's unlikely that these two names being the same is a coincidence, especially when you consider that the Colanthus house colors are, like the birds themselves, red and yellow. Now, recall the meeting between Kvothe and the Kvothe, the one that sets him on this path of regicide. As Kvothe approaches the tree, the Kvothe is killing butterflies, one of which is a crimson butterfly, with faint traces of metallic gold, red and yellow, the same colors as the royal house. Patrick Rothfuss has confirmed that Kvothe will be visiting Rennere, the three-part city where Roderick holds court. We also know that men at court there are allowed to wear swords, and in one of the more blatant pieces of foreshadowing in the entire series, the mayor says this about that practice. I could not help but notice you are armed, he remarked, disapproval heavy on his voice. My hand went unconsciously to 𝐊𝐶ura. It was at my hip now, rather than over my shoulder. Is there aught amiss with that, your grace? I have understood that all men keep the right to gird themselves in Vintas. It is hardly proper, he stressed the word. I understand that in the king's court in Rennere, there's not a gentleman who would dare be seen without a sword. Well spoken as you are no gentleman, Alvaron pointed out coolly, as you would do well to remember. Besides, it is a barbarian custom, and one that will bring the king to grief in time. You can begin to see, at least roughly, the tragedy that is about to take place. Kvothe will head to Rennere, and while there, he will unsheath 𝐊𝐶ura and slay the Vintish king. We've answered the who, but now we need to find out why and how. Because why would Kvothe feel the need to kill a king? And how would he even get close enough to do it? Kvothe claims that he rescues a sleeping princess from a barrow king, and most fans feel that this refers to Ari, and that she's secretly Princess Ariel. Now, Princess Ariel is mentioned exactly one time in the books, but there are plenty of theories that she's actually of Vintish nobility, meaning she's the daughter of Roderick Colanthus. This is supported by the fact that Patrick Rothfuss has hinted that 𝐊𝐹a, the first king of Vintas, is the sleeping barrow king. Saving a Vintish princess from a dead Vintish king seems fitting.
He is 𝐊𝐹a, king in life and king in death. 𝐊𝐹a is a dead king buried in the proper way, a man with a will to make a nation, and a man such as that does not merely die if he does not wish to, he comes back as a drog. You come back as Wizard King 𝐊𝐹a, first king, always king, in his barrow watching the lands. Through his will alone does 𝐊𝐹a continue to watch over Vintas. You learn a little bit more about 𝐊𝐯𝐭𝐡𝐞 in Book 3. You didn't get a spoiler. I mean, 𝐊𝐯𝐭𝐡's already come up in the books. And as have Barrow. I mean, Kvothe literally says, have you not read him? I have stolen princesses back from sleeping Barrow kings.
Rescuing the daughter of a king and returning her home would surely grant Kvothe access to 𝐊𝐶𝐿𝐴NTHUS. And honestly, it's hard to ascertain what else could give him access to someone as important as the Sovereign of Intas. By the end of Wise Man's Fear, there isn't some obvious avenue he could take that would allow him to meet Roderick. So let's say that the likeliest option at this time is the return of a missing princess. But why would Kvothe then kill Roderick? It would have to be for a very good reason. Kvothe isn't, at least in the 2 books we have, a bloodthirsty person. He doesn't kill people for no reason. In fact, the 2 times that he's taken lives, it was in service of a good cause. He kills several bandits in the Eld Forest to save his companions, and later in the novel kills a group of false troopers who had kidnapped 2 girls and were abusing them. So whatever the reason, it would have to be quite severe to provoke that sort of reaction out of Kvothe. It may be that the false trooper story is a hint of what's to come in the Doors of Stone. If Kvothe returns Princess Ariel to her father, and then discovers that he's abusive, it's pretty easy to see that in a split-second decision he would choose to kill 𝐊𝐿ANTHUS. But having said that, there's no evidence that 𝐊𝐿ANTHUS is that type of person. In fact, we don't have any idea what sort of man 𝐊𝐿ANTHUS really is. Mayor Alvron doesn't like him, but the mayor and the king are in a power struggle, so naturally they're not going to have a lot of love for each other. Roderick 𝐊𝐿ANTHUS as a king and as a man is a complete mystery to us. Another option is that he's an agent of the Chandrian. That does seem like a very obvious reason for Kvothe to slay him, but there aren't really any links that connect him to the Chandrian. The mayor is hinted to be close to the emir, as we learn from the Kvothe, so maybe that could mean that Roderick is close to the Chandrian. There have been questions for years on why Cinder was hanging out in the Eld Forest robbing tax collectors. It could be that Cinder, for some reason, is attempting to cause friction between the mayor and Roderick 𝐊𝐿ANTHUS. Maybe by stealing the money and therefore ensuring 𝐊𝐿ANTHUS never receives the gold from the mayor, it's an attempt for Roderick 𝐊𝐿ANTHUS to have an excuse to eliminate the mayor. And Kvothe, upon discovering that Roderick is working with the Chandrian, then kills him. Another option is that Kvothe is binded with an amber ring and forced to kill 𝐊𝐿ANTHUS. Who would do that and why? No idea. Could be the Chandrian, could be the emir, who knows. And lastly, there is a chance that Kvothe never actually killed a king, and instead was framed for it. This isn't impossible, but it does seem unlikely considering that he personally feels he's at fault for the Vintage Civil War. This still leaves us with the question of who the penitent king is. He would have to have power, and the ability to command armies, and deep enough pockets so that he could pay newly enlisted troops an entire gold royal. He would, of course, also have to feel regret over something, enough so that his kingly title revolves around it. So who would feel that much regret? The only reasonable choice is Mayor Alvron. The mayor had Kvothe in his court, the same Kvothe that will later kill a king, cause a war, and somehow free the Skraeł and allow them to roam the world. Yeah, Alvron probably has a lot of regret for associating with one of the most infamous men in Temerant. Another big question that I don't see brought up a lot in the fandom is who the rebels are. Maybe it's not important, it could just be a distant 𝐊𝐿ANTHUS relative who we don't know. But I do find it rather curious that we never hear about the rebels specifically. The only named characters that have a somewhat realistic shot at being rebels would be Baron Jackas or Ambrose Jackas. It's not crazy to theorize that after the king is killed, they make a power grab for the throne. Regardless, it looks likely that Roderick 𝐊𝐿ANTHUS will not survive the Doors of Stone. Our last series of questions revolves around Kvothe and the Frame story, and it's one of the largest mysteries of these books. How did the traumatized, yet still motivated Kvothe of the past become the apathetic and depressed Kvothe of the present? Why is he hiding out in an inn? Where are his friends? Where is Denna? Is she dead? Why does he seem unable to perform sympathy? Why doesn't he sing? Why is he a man waiting to die? We can establish that one reason Kvothe is hiding out in an inn is because he's responsible for the Vintage Civil War. We can wager that most of the citizenry, and no doubt the nobles and the penitent king himself, don't take too kindly to a man who has led to the death of thousands and destabilized an entire nation. So it does make sense that he's hiding, though why he chose to hide in the country he killed a king in, who knows. We also know that the Skrael, those giant spider-like creatures that attack Carter in the frame, now wander Temerant, and Kvothe is somehow responsible for this. What that means exactly, we don't know. Somehow, someway, Kvothe has allowed the Skrael to travel between the Fae and Temerant. Those are two pretty major reasons that Kvothe would bow out and spend the rest of his days hiding in an inn. But this is the Doors of Stone we're talking about, so of course there's more. In the frame story, Kvothe is powerless, or at the very least, significantly weaker compared to his past self. He doesn't seem able to use sympathy intentionally, as we see when he fails to light the skin dancer on fire. But he does shatter a bottle of strawberry wine by accident, so he must still have a remnant of that power somewhere within himself. He also can't fight, as we see when he gets rather thoroughly beaten by the soldiers, which is pretty odd considering he was trained by the Bloodshirt mercenaries. He doesn't play music either, nor do we see him ever use the name of the wind, or really any name for that matter. So what happened? Why is Kvothe, now Kote, which means disaster in Siaru, as we learned from Master Kilvin, seemingly powerless? First, it should be mentioned that many fans have discussed if Kvothe is merely acting as a harmless and weak innkeeper, to the point that he's totally absorbed that identity, or if there's indeed something more magical at work. Sometimes adopting a false persona can eventually consume you, and that could very well be part of the problem. 2 years as an innkeeper and Kvothe is losing his edge. But that can't be the whole story, because in Kvothe's room, there lies a thrice-locked chest. It's made of the heavy and incredibly expensive roa wood, and it has a lock of iron, copper, and one unseen, and Kvothe seems unable to open it. Many suspect that inside this chest is Kvothe's true name, and that because he's changed it, likely because of regret over his actions, he's lost many of his abilities. Judging from Elladan's reaction in Wise Man's Fear, changing your true name is dangerous. This could explain why his naming, sympathy, and fighting abilities have disappeared. And the fact that he can't even open the thing makes it even more damning. He even asks Bast in a hypothetical scenario how he would open it. And judging by the Doors of Stone prologue, Kvothe, or Bast, plans to use that advice to open the chest with acid. Another possibility of why Kvothe has lost his powers is a promise he makes to Denna. I swear I won't attempt to uncover your patron. I swear it on my name and on my power. I swear it by my good left hand. I swear it by the ever-moving moon. In a world of magic, a Fey realm, and mysterious immortal beings who kill those who learn about them, it's not crazy to think that a vow like this could affect you, especially if you were to break it. Kvothe doesn't seem to have a good left hand anymore. He doesn't play music at all. We do get a little bit of singing from him in the frame, but no lute. Strange, considering how important music is to Kvothe. Maybe that vow changed him. Or if he changed his true name, music was one of the casualties. And of course, because this is Doors of Stone, there are even more questions to this mystery of frame story Kvothe. So we've already established that he's a broken man mentally, and he could be genuinely powerless or putting on an act. But there's something else at play here. We learned in the Doors of Stone prologue, read to us by Patrick Rothfuss in 2021, that Kvothe seems to be planning something. We learn that the inn is built on top of greystones. We also learn it has copper doorknobs. And we learn the entire inn itself was specifically designed by Kvothe.
The third silence was not an easy thing to notice. If you listened long enough, you might begin to feel it in the chill copper of the Waystone's locks, turned tight to keep the night at bay. It lurked in the thick timbers of the door and nestled deep in the building's gray foundation stones. And it was in the hands of the man who had designed the inn, as he slowly undressed himself beside a bare and narrow bed.
Why would a man waiting to die place such great care in designing his inn? This goes beyond some care for how his inn looks. Because why would he have the foundations be greystones, which seem to be doors to the Fae and could have other magical properties? Why make the doorknobs copper, which seem to inhibit naming, as we learn from Elladan? And lastly, why mention that the inn was designed by Kvothe? Is he using this inn to protect himself from namers and shapers? It is a popular theory that copper cannot be named, and is therefore a useful tool against namers. And building your inn on a foundation of greystones is probably important too. Maybe it's an easy portal to the Fae, or perhaps it provides some additional protection. There are those that theorize that Kvothe is playing a beautiful game, that the Waystone Inn is a giant trap, one set to catch the Chandrian. I won't reiterate the whole spiel from a moment ago about the inn, but it's good to keep in mind the copper doorknobs and the grey foundation stones. Because if you were to plan a trap for the Chandrian, you would want to weaken their naming and shaping abilities. Now, we aren't sure what other powers they may possess, but those might also be hampered by copper. Now, to draw in the Chandrian, you would need to say their true names. Kvothe has been fairly careful about speaking their true names, but if you were to say them several more times in the Doors of Stone, they could probably locate him, and thus the trap would be set. In a different and more traditional fantasy story, one can easily see this being a great and climactic ending. That the whole time, Kvothe was secretly pretending to be Kote, and that he had this secret grand plan. The only issue here is this doesn't quite work thematically. We're told that this story is a tragedy, that it's not going to end well for Kvothe, which conflicts with the idea that this plan will be successful, or that it even exists. Don't get me wrong, there is obviously more to this inn than meets the eye, but it may not be a trap. It could be that this inn is part of Kvothe's self-inflicted punishment. He is a man filled with regret. Whatever he did in the years preceding the present story obviously haunts him. So it may follow that this inn is his own personal cell, that he put his true name in a chest and lined the walls with copper to ensure that his abilities were silenced. In fact, the silence in the prologue could be referring to the odd quality air takes when the walls are lined with copper, as we see during the scene with Eladin in the Haven. But Kvothe may be regretting this self-inflicted exile. We see that he takes one perfect step of the Khatan, and he may be trying to open his thrice-locked chest. Those are not the steps of a man attempting to forget all he knows and wait for death. So maybe the old Kvothe is beginning to wake up, whether that be because of a master plan, or simply that he feels he needs to set things right, is unknown. Once again, this story is a tragedy, so if Doors ever releases, don't expect a happy and triumphant ending. Maybe Kvothe will get a few of the Chandrian. Maybe he'll kill Cinder, allow Haliax to rest, and then die himself. Who knows? All we can do is wait for the third book. And that's all I have. There will be more Doors of Stone theories to come. There is a whole lot to discuss about the Chandrian, the Emir, Denna, and so much more about this world. So until then, thank you for watching.